In this session, we want to discuss how a plant actually responds to a stimulus from its environment. The general consensus, I believe, is that plants are not very good at responding to their environment. To the contrary, they have very distinct responses to their environment, some of which we've already discussed with the other plant hormones, how they can respond to changes in temperature and increased growth patterns and so on. But the general responses to stimuli are known as tropisms. So you may have a tropism to a particular thing. We don't typically talk about it as tropisms in people, but your aversion or like for particular things is very much a tropism. So in plants we talk about phototropisms, or a response to light, gravitropisms, or literally a response to gravity, and thigmotropism, which is response to touch. Now these tropisms can be positive. The plants could grow towards that stimulus, or they could be negative. They could grow away from a particular stimulus. But for us, what we're looking at is how this impacts their distribution of hormones, because a tropism and their ability to grow towards or away from a stimulus is based on all the other hormones we've discussed. So we discussed 5 particular hormones that aid in plant growth, and if you don't remember all of them, you can refer to that video. But anything that's going to increase cell division, anything that's going to increase cell elongation, will be very important for these different types of tropisms. Phototropism is probably the one you're most familiar with. If you have a plant that sits near a window, it will reach and stretch and bend, and rather than growing straight up as you would expect from a plant, we actually see it lean towards a window to get as much light as possible. Well, what causes it to do this? And if you have seen any of the time-lapse video of phototropisms, this happens on a daily basis. The plant will turn all day long in an attempt to get towards as much of that light as possible. And what we see is an actual cell elongation. Hormones contributing to that elongation of cells will actually help to bend the plant in the particular direction as it's trying to get closer to the light. We see the same thing with gravitropism. On the left here we have a seed that is germinated, and we have the shoot that will be going up and out of the ground, and we have a root that starts and grows straight down. And this is a seed that would be positioned straight in the soil with gravity pulling down, okay, and elongating those cells. But we'd also see a negative tropism in the shoot, where it's trying to grow away from gravity and up and out of the ground. Our seed on the right here has actually been turned partway through germination. So you see that it had started to kind of grow down, and this part of the root you can kind of see is actually starting to even get root hairs associated with it. But then someone came and moved this seed. And when they did, that seed is now trying to turn itself, and here you see it's actually growing a different root in response to that turning of the seed, so that it will actually grow down now again in response to gravity and not have this bend to it that this one currently has. And you can see this in potted plants as well. There are lots of experiments posted online that show you people who have started plants in their pots laying on their side, and the plant will actually turn a 90-degree turn and try to grow either straight up and the roots straight down. Thigmotropism is response to touch. Here I give you a picture of what we call a sensitive plant. And if some of you have seen these, when you touch them, in this case with a colored pencil, they're touching it, it's actually causing the leaves to fold closed. This is in response to an organism chewing on it. Now, of course, the colored pencil is not chewing on the plant, but in response to any sort of touch, this plant is going to make itself as small as possible in the hopes that it will be looked at as not as nutritious right? And the idea would be that a grazer may leave this plant alone if the leaves don't look large enough and full enough to support the nutrients that herbivore needs. Right, herbivore being a plant eater, right? So we see this in a lot of different plants. Thigmotropism is also what helps our tendrils in our pea plants grow. We saw tendrils as a shoot modification, reaching out, wrapping around, and pulling the plant up. This would be the same response in how it's able to actually do that. Now, these are not tropisms that we would associate with you necessarily, but circadian rhythm is certainly something we associate with humans. Plants also have circadian rhythms. They are cued by the exact same thing you are, hormones and light. So when we look at circadian rhythms, or the roughly 24-hour cycle of a plant or you, okay, in our plant here, we're actually going to look at it as being associated with when it flowers. And we do see in some plants that during the daytime they will get all kind of spread out so they can absorb as much light as possible, but that takes a lot of energy. They're constantly circulating water and keeping those leaves full so that they can get as much photosynthetic light as possible. But at night that's not necessary. So the leaves tend to kind of fold down and sort of relax at night. Very important for maintaining balance and levels of energy within the plant. So in a plant, this is something we call a photoperiod. So we associate the circadian rhythms with the length of day and night. I think you're probably all aware that we get a longer photoperiod or daylight time frame in the summer than in the winter. In our shortest days in the winter, around the winter solstice, we may only have 7.5 hours of light in northeastern United States, but in the summertime we can have upwards of 15 or 16 hours of light in some cases. This has a strong effect on plants, particularly ones that flower in response to that. So when we look at photoperiod in the pie graphs on this slide, our photoperiod, the yellow is when the sun would be out and the gray is when it would be dark. Now please keep in mind these are 24-hour cycles, okay, or 24-hour circles. So in this case you're looking at 8 hours of light and about 16 hours of dark, as opposed to 16 hours of light and 8 hours of dark on these circles or on these pie graphs, okay? So what we call short day and long day plants are very, very common. So some of the first plants that we see come out and bloom in the springtime in the northeast United States are actually daffodils. And so when we look at those, they're what we consider a short day plant. They're actually going to become active and bloom, germinate, become active and bloom during still relatively short days. But our long day plants, we're going to look at them flowering only when we get to a much shorter night. And so in a lot of cases, remember, we'll also be talking about a plant in this case that requires a lot of warmth and a high level of sunshine to germinate, flower, reproduce, produce seeds, and do any other growth patterns and storage of sugars that it needs during that period. So as herbivores are one of the biggest predators, of course, of plants, we have to consider how a plant can respond to an herbivore. I always have to think of my friends that say that they're herbivores because plants can't run away, and I tell them that the plants don't run away just because they haven't given them enough time. Vegetarian will outrun a plant any day, right? So when we look at our plants, how can they actually counter herbivores? Because they aren't running, right? We've already talked about thorns, so modification of stems and leaves to help kind of counter defenses that way. We can also look at chemical defenses. This is one we haven't talked about yet, but is perhaps the most interesting one. Chemical defenses can actually, in many cases, are associated just simply with toxic compounds that make the plant taste bad. So those of you that are super tasters and really don't like broccoli because it's bitter and cabbage because it's bitter, take that to a whole nother level, to the point where that toxic chemical or that distastefulness would actually be so powerful you wouldn't eat it even as an herbivore or as a caterpillar in nature. But plants have also developed another very interesting mechanism. We look at their associations with other organisms. This is something we call coevolution that we'll come back to when we talk macroevolution in a future video. But when we think about herbivores eating plants, so if our caterpillar is actually eating our plant here, right? That's signaling to the plant. The plant knows it's being damaged. The plant is not unaware of the fact that it's being eaten, okay? But it's producing a chemical pathway that releases a chemical through its stomata that attracts, in this case, a wasp, okay? And you see here this wasp sitting on the back of the caterpillar. Turns out that caterpillar is going to play host to hatching that wasp's eggs. What do I mean by that? Well, the plant has sent a signal that attracts a wasp to say, hey, look over here. There's this caterpillar eating me. The wasp needs to find those caterpillars because the caterpillar is going to incubate the wasp eggs. When those wasp eggs then hatch, they will literally eat the caterpillar from the inside out and hatch out of the back of the caterpillar. Well, this is not an instantaneous get the caterpillar off of me sort of response, right? This is a long-term kind of let's keep this caterpillar from eating me response. But in the meantime, the wasp has found a terrific place to lay its eggs. Plants have also developed different pathogen defense mechanisms. So we would think about these like antibiotics. So how does a plant produce essentially an antibiotic to keep away microbes, bacteria, and so on that might be infecting it? Well, they're not very good at it, as you might imagine. Their epidermis or their dermal tissue plays the same role yours does. Let's keep as much out as possible. It serves as a protective barrier on the outside of the plant. But those things are still going to get in. Okay, they're going to get bacterial infections, they're going to get fungal infections. The plant is going to be fairly limited in what it can do other than tell the rest of itself that it's infected. So let me show you what I mean. So say that a plant gets infected with a particular pathogen, okay? That pathogen produces a protein as it's living off of the plant. That protein actually signals within the plant that it's infected. Okay, so the plant knows it has an infection. That particular leaf, it's gone. It's done for. Okay, but what we can do in the plant is it will produce hormones in response to that infection that travel throughout the plant. Well, it travels through the vascular tissue, right? Okay, it's a hormone, it's a chemical. It's going to travel through the vascular tissue. The rest of the plant will pick up on this signal that the leaf is infected. The plant has an infection, and will actually start producing chemicals that can counter that infection. So the plant may become infected in one side, one leaf, but that infection will be limited in its spread because of these signaling pathways to produce essentially antibiotics. Pretty cool, huh?